So good afternoon everybody, my name is Prashant. I work at Revealing Our Creations and I'm here to talk to you about Twitter's JavaScript framework called Flight. So I assume that most of you are associated with Ruby, which is why we are here at RubyConf because of Rails. Rails is a full stack web application framework, but whenever we talk about Rails, we end up mostly discussing about your Ruby code, your gems, all the backend stuff, but hardly anything about the front end, hardly anything really happening in the JavaScript or the CSS space. So recently when I was exploring my options of how I could improve my situation a bit when I'm working in the front end, I explored lots of options. Obviously there are tons of things to choose from, but I chanced upon Flight, and I think for a couple of reasons, in fact for lots of reasons, I'll show you which of which I'll show you about. I think it's a really good fit for Rails applications, and I wanted to show you a bit about, talk to you a bit about what we can do with Flight and how you can get started using Flight in your Rails applications. So as it advertises on the tin, it maps behavior to DOM nodes, which means that there's a concept of a component in Flight. Components vary depending on the framework. In a Flight, a component is an object which binds to a particular node on the DOM, and then which can send and receive events and do other lots of cool things. It's very lightweight. So why would you choose Flight from the thousands of options available to you? This one. I think most of you, whenever you do JavaScript programming, you are in a very gray area sort of a thing. There's hardly any object-oriented. You love object-oriented programming in Ruby and Java, whatever you have, but you hardly get to experience that when you're doing JavaScript. I think JavaScript is a capable enough language to allow you those things. So we'll see how Flight can take you there. You love event-driven, so if you know about the Hollywood principle, don't call us, we'll call you, or if you're aware of the observer pattern, or you've worked with other evented frameworks, you'll love Flight. We're not talking about Rails there, of course, but from the numerous other options available, many of them come with their own baggage. Flight really does away with most of the baggage. It gives you a very raw JavaScript that you can almost learn today, which takes us there. It's really very quick to learn, and you probably can get started in a couple of days, and within a week's time you'll be running. So I'll begin with a piece of code which I think will get you motivated to use Flight. I just wanted to tell you that I'll be using JavaScript in my slides because, thanks for the clap. Firstly, because CoffeeScript is a nice thing. It's a nice syntactic sugar on JavaScript. It hides many of the problems and complexities you'll run into coding JavaScript, or rather CoffeeScript, when you actually do CoffeeScript. So also because I come from a Java background, so I'm more comfortable doing JavaScript. So the heart of Flight is what is called a component. It's a constructor. So I'm not sure if you knew that JavaScript also has a constructor. It's very much an object-oriented programming language. So you attach a component, as I said earlier, to one of these DOM nodes using a CSS selector. It could be an element, it could really be a class, or it could be an ID or whatever have you. And the whole basis of how Flight works is using events. So how many of you have not worked with Bootstrap? Good, nice. Very few hands. All right, so that's resounding yes. So you know that in Bootstrap, I'll just give you an example here. It might seem like a contrived example, but I think it hits it home. So in Bootstrap, there's no way for you to currently get the current device that you're running your application on. So you don't know whether it's a tablet or a phone or a larger screen device. There are CSS classes obviously that can dictate your styling, but there's no way for you to get that what I'm calling environment back into your code if you want to. So here's a code that actually lets you do that. A hack, but what I'm doing here is I'm trying to add a hidden hyphen environment class, appending it to the body, and just checking if it is hidden or not. So if it is hidden, which means it does mean that that class actually worked, and that is the current environment we are in, right? Make sense? So you may be able to check the environment whenever you resize the window. So that's how you do it. I think this should be easy. So whenever you resize, you call the previous function. All right, so we'll take it a step further. We'll report the environment only when it actually changes. So when it actually hits a breakpoint from LG to SM to XS and so on, then only will this function return you something. I just added a check to actually check whether the environment actually changed from the last one or not, and then only will I return something, otherwise I won't. Right, so this is the problem that takes us direct into the heart of flight. So I wrote this function in a particular piece of code in my application that I got the current Bootstrap environment from. But what if I want to do some cool things depending on whether the environment has changed? I might need to change some of my CSS classes, do some cool things depending on what the current environment is after the change happens. There's no other way to do this except for doing it evented, right? And that's what lands us plump in the heart of flight. So the code should look very familiar from what it was earlier, except for the difference at the end. You can see the line in the first block, the last line, this dot trigger, and I'm triggering an event, and I'm passing along the new environment as the data in the env variable. The rest remains exactly the same. So now this becomes immensely useful. So now I can make this thing available to the rest of my application. I'll show you how. The first thing that I do is that the previous thing was a component, a flight component. I attach it to a node on my DOM, which happens to be document. The choice of document here is really specific. I'll tell you later a bit about that. So I attach it to the document. That's how you create a flight component and attach it to a node. And also in my application, for the sake of assumption, let's say we have other components similarly defined in their own ways and attached to their own respective selectors. So now we have an application going. Now let's assume we consider this first component down there called my list. Also note that the attached to functions did not, that one actually at the end is wrong. Attached to functions do not actually return anything. That's very important as well. I'll tell you why. So this is the mylist component. If you can see there, it actually received that event from the first component and did something depending on that. So I think this is very cool. If you can see this, what I've done is that I've actually decoupled my events, made them system-wide, and I've set up listeners to listen to those events throughout my application. So the rest of my application can listen to those events and do cool things accordingly. In fact, if you noticed, after my first function got called, I'm triggering yet another event. So there's a chain of triggers that you can set off, right? So that brings us to what really flight really was. It's event driven. You can create components that are encapsulated, that actually encapsulate functionality, and it gets bound to an element on the DOM. How do you install it? If you are into Ruby, you'd probably try doing this, but this is not exactly what you'd expect. So flight doesn't really come as a gem. You can download it from its GitHub repo, or better still, you can use Bower. So how many of you have already started using Bower in any of your projects? Very few. That means that link at the bottom should be a good start on the next page actually. Should be a good start for you to get started using Bower in your Rails application. What is Bower? Probably you've heard of it, probably you've seen it on other projects. It's similar to Bundler, but specific to JavaScript and CSS assets. So you kind of decouple your front-end development from the back-end right away if you use Bower, because you don't have to depend on gems to update your dependencies, especially the front-end dependencies, which kind of are generally, they always kind of lag behind whenever you get a gem file for those things. So it's a nice idea. Please check it out. The link at the bottom is a blog post that we wrote that you should check it out. That you should check out. So this is how you install Flight when using Bower, assuming you already have Bower installed. Flight is a very small file when gzipped and minified, under 6K. It does depend on jQuery, but the assumption is that most of you, if you're coming from Rails, you already have jQuery installed. I also want to talk to you a bit about AMD. So earlier, Swanand had a very nice and enlightening talk about how he tried to restructure his Rails applications differently than how DHH intended them to be. You can do similar things in JavaScript if you are aware of AMD and you know how to do this. So AMD stands for Asynchronous Module Definition. People coming from the JavaScript world have known these things for years and years, but it's probably new to most of us here, so I thought it's worth getting into a bit. It helps, AMD is a specification, an API that tells the browser to load your scripts asynchronously, which means that the browser doesn't have to wait for the scripts to load before it renders the whole page. If you know what I mean, I think you'll really be happy that you are able to actually do that. You can specify your dependencies because your scripts may depend on other scripts for them to work. So you can specify the load order dependencies also. And it does really get you a bit closer to how you can do object-oriented programming in JavaScript. So worth checking it out. Require.js is an implementation of the AMD spec. There are other implementations also. There's curl.js. But this is, I think, one of the most popular and one of the oldest also. So another small example of how you can use require.js in your code. So in this particular small piece of code, if you work with Bootstrap, there's a plugin called Collapse, which actually depends on transition, which of course eventually depends on jQuery. So you have specified here that for this particular block of code to run, you need those 3 plugins to be available before you can actually execute anything inside that block. And of course, you've also maintained the dependencies because you cannot really load jQuery before you load the collapse and the transition plugins. So that's a directive to the browser to do that accordingly. And the other good thing is that I'm not sure how many of you are aware that when you get a Bootstrap gem, generally that's how you probably do it so far, you get the whole shebang, you get the whole 12 or odd plugins that come bundled with Bootstrap. But I guess in your projects you end up mostly using just a couple, maybe 3 or 4 at most. There's no way to do this otherwise except for maybe going with an approach like this. Note that I just loaded the collapse and the transition plugins, and probably I might, if I don't need any other plugins from Bootstrap, that's all I need, right? So it really shaves off so much of my extra stuff that actually gets bundled up in my application.js file at the end, which I think is a very cool thing. In fact, the good thing about this is that even jQuery, the major mammoth of a library, it also now ships with an AMD support, so you can do the same thing with jQuery. You got tons and tons of plugins which you can selectively load. Obviously, it's going to take a while before you actually get a hang of which ones you actually need, but it's possible to do the same with jQuery. So I think it's very interesting, and it really cuts down on your downloads that come along with your assets. Okay, so this is exactly the same thing, but written in another syntax. This is shorthand notation, as they say. And I think this will be more familiar to Ruby developers. So you require those scripts in order and do whatever you have to do at the end. So the big question, and of course, hell yes, you can, which is why I'm talking about this. So there's a very nice gem called require.js Rails, which bundles right into the asset pipeline, and does give you these things for free. I'll just quickly run through this. What this means for you is that we'll no longer be using the required directives in your application.js files, so which means also that you'll have to require those files that you need in your project independently and manually. But yeah, if you can see the last 3 points, I think this is very important because you actually can now require only the JS files that you need for your project, which kind of gives you a feel of how you do object-oriented stuff in Ruby and elsewhere. So let's go back to Flight. That was a long diversion. So coming back to how you define a component, the guts will now be familiar to you if you were paying attention earlier on. You just surrounded with the bits of code that actually define a Flight component. But I won't go too deep into this. I'll rather have you look at how you do the same thing using require.js, which is how Flight even recommends you to use it. I think to note here, you could take a look at this.attributes, which is a place where you can define some of your attributes that kind of defaults. You can specify some of your CSS selectors and maybe some variables that won't change throughout the application. It promotes decoupling because once you define things over there, you can directly refer to them in your code. And then if you need some changes, you can change directly in the attributes and it gets reflected elsewhere in your component. So here what I'm doing is, in fact, in this code, you remember the event that I triggered from my first code. I got the bootstrap environment changed. Now I received that event in this particular component, and let's say I fiddle around a bit with the classes that are applied on this component of mine or any child of this component. So I'm doing selective classes depending on what event actually or what environment actually got triggered. And this, again, going back to refresh your memories, this is how you'll do attach a component to a DOM. So I'm attaching it to the div.nav element. And again, I'm using require at the top, so that's where you can see that I'm actually requiring navbar before I attach it to an element. It's your choice really, but I'd strongly recommend you to go with require.js because it's a very nice thing to learn, and you'll be future ready for, if just in case you happen to love Node.js more than Rails at some point in time, you'll be ready for that. So we defined a component. Yes, I talked about that. The good thing is that when you define this component, nobody else knows about this because attached to function didn't really return anything. So it doesn't return any handle, which again is a way to decouple your applications, because now this component is going only to respond to events that get triggered and can only trigger events. So you can maybe remove a component one day and the whole application will just go on as if nothing really happened. Yeah. So this is a conceptual idea about how Flight recommends you to kind of design your components. There are UI components, which is about everything that you can touch and feel and see and click. So all those events will be taken by something conceptually called a UI component, and it generates UI events. Data components is something that's kind of, okay, so if you've done pub sub, you know, probably are in familiar territory. This will be a kind of pub publisher which actually lets everybody know, whoever is listening, for any change in data here in this case. So there's generally one per, or maybe you can divide your stuff, you can maybe design your app in such a way that you can group similar functionalities into a data component of its own and so on, but there are generally very few of them, and they are generally bound to the document element. So if you noticed, I'm not sure, but there's an initialize function which actually initializes the component for you. At the bottom of the code, you see that we begin with the initialize function, and there's a similar thing for teardown when you want to close it all down. And there's also the advice API that Flights gives you. So which means that whatever went inside after initialize was called after the initialize function of the component got fired. So if you notice what we just did, we've actually added eventing to even our regular function calls, and Flight very graciously makes it available to you for your regular use as well. So over here, I'm giving you an example of how you can override, kind of, in a way, a function definition, a regular function definition. So this particular method will normally just print out world, but you can define some another function, another class like this, which actually makes use of the advice API to override the behavior of the regular print function, and in which it's trying to print hello before the print function actually gets called. So if you see what I just did there, if I run print now, it will print hello before it prints world. So it can be useful in many ways, and at least it's very cool to know that you can actually do these sort of things using Flight. This.node is the node on which your component is bound. You can select your attributes that you set in this.attributes using this.atter, and then you can select them that way. That's the syntax. So events, now the backbone of how Flight works. This must be very familiar to you if you know jQuery. You trigger an event and you receive an event and listen to an event. Note that here you need to pass a data that is serializable, because Flight specifically checks for that. When you trigger an event, you can pass on this data, like we passed the environment variable in our first example. So you can do that sort of a thing. And you can handle an event in which you can receive the data that somebody passed and this received. That's the second parameter of the this function definition at the end. So you can receive whatever data was passed along with the trigger that happened. So this is the way in which events can keep talking to each other and generating events without actually knowing the existence of each other. Pretty cool, right? So just in case you were not aware, I think this is something that's nice to know in terms of Flight, and not just in terms of Flight, but even beyond. So whenever an event occurs on, let's say, the li element, one of these item elements, obviously, okay, so the way Flight works is that you can maybe create a component that binds itself to the item element, and both of these li elements will now be listening and will be in a position now to listen and trigger events, right? So when that happens, after li has triggered it, it flies up to the ul element because that's its parent, then it goes up to body, and then goes up to the document, and then goes up to the window. So any element that occurs inside li is now, it will bubble up one by one after the other, ultimately when it reaches the window element. You see that there's a div element down there, but it has no awareness of the events going on around, unless there's another component bound to that div element which is actually listening to the event that was fired. So unless that happens, div has no clue about what's going on around it. Some naming conventions, you probably noticed that we have some very funny sounding function names, but that's actually not by design, but by convention actually, because you want to name your events in the passive voice, because then you kind of enforce the idea that really you have to design this component in its isolation. You can't really assume that there's anything else that exists. So that's how you name your events, that when you say, let's say for instance, a form was submitted, you say form submitted. You don't actually name it like a verb, but as an action that has already happened, and then anybody who is interested can now listen into that event. Similar things for data and handle events that you just saw probably. Data, well, so we haven't really been talking much about the data, but only about events and components. I think this is also why this, in fact, is by design, because Flight doesn't really prescribe much in this space. It really leaves things up to you to decide how you want to structure your data, how you want to handle your data, how you want to move your data around. And in fact, it doesn't really matter to it if you're doing the rendering on the server or the client. It's totally agnostic to these things. But it does very strongly kind of suggest that as far as possible, you end up using data attributes on the DOM element itself, because that's so native to your HTML that it doesn't really depend on anything else as well. So, and I think it's a nice thing to know, because in fact, even if you've ever checked the source of your Twitter profile page, or wherever, in fact, anywhere on twitter.com, you'll see that it's full of tons and tons of data attributes defined on all of its elements. So Flight, of course, is used at Twitter, so they know what they're doing, right? And the triggers themselves, they probably generally are designed to transport and transfer just the enough amount of information that the receiving component can use to infer the state of the application, which means that I may just send a trigger with an ID, and it's up to the other component who's actually listening to my event to figure out the rest of the state of the application using that ID. So that's the kind of decoupled, hands-off approach to data that Flight recommends. Mixins is a very powerful concept introduced by Flight. People who, obviously, if you're doing Ruby for a bit, you would probably have already used mixins, and it's very familiar, very similar to that. You know what a mixin does. If you have code that is common across many classes, you extract it out into a mixin, and then your classes can reuse that. The thing here is with flight mixins is that the lifecycle functions events that a component receives, if it is using a mixin, the mixin also will respond to the events that that receives, and it kind of ties into the lifecycle event, so that when a component is attached, the mixin also gets attached, and vice versa. In fact, not vice versa, but when actually tears down, the mixin will be the first to be torn down before the flight actually gets torn down. And by that last point, that's a way to introduce the concept of multiple inheritance into JavaScript, which is again very powerful. I'll give you an example. How many of you have tried to do client-side rendering? You know what it means? Okay, I think I'll need to explain it a bit. So generally you try to, you use your ERB templates to pump out your, ready HTML page, but there's a way to do the opposite. You just ship your HTML with all those elements, and you actually make a separate request back to the server to get the JSON, which you use to stuff all those elements out. So and in fact, it's a good approach. There are pros and cons to both client-side rendering and server-side, but one good point to that is that it kind of makes you think in terms of the API. So if you want to write API-heavy backend sort of a thing, and you may code your application in such a way. If you do it in fact in this way, then you'll be having a good structure on the backend to serve solid APIs, which you can then consume by your own application. So what I do here is that I pick and choose each of those classes one by one and stuff the JSON data back into them. I hope this is clear to you. So has anybody used Mustache here? No? Okay, so Mustache is another templating system for the front end. We have ERB as a templating system for the back end, for ERB. Mustache is a string-based templating system that you feed, let's say you give that sort of a structure. Now, you can see that it's immediately so much more readable than having the first version. If you're familiar with ERB, it must be more familiar already and so much more readable. So you can sometimes, if you're doing client-side rendering especially, you can resort to using templates on the client, and then that's how you end up writing it. It's a very simple syntax. So all that is doing is that it will give you h1, h4, and div tags in which you have placeholders for the title, author, and content, which you can then render using the template. I'm using Hogan, which implements the Mustache spec. Hogan also is by Twitter. It's a little faster. It's a better performance. So this is a way in which you can achieve the exact same thing that this code did without really resorting to needing to actually stuff all those elements out. And imagine this is just three elements. Imagine a page in which you probably may have dozens of elements in which you want to fill out data. So templates are in fact is the only way to go, to be honest. So what I've done is that I've extracted that information out from the first code here, piece of code, because you need to run your AJAX calls and you need to receive your success and error events. So whenever a call to this mixin actually comes up, this is actually a mixin now. Whenever this mixin is initialized, you get the getData function, which calls the function right at the top, which sends out an AJAX request to the URL. You can see the URL property filled with something that I'll show you what it means. But you can guess that it's the URL field from this.atter, which is actually taking it from the component that uses it. So this can trigger, once the success happens, this will trigger an event, data AJAX success, again in the passive, and actually send out the data that I actually got from the AJAX response. It can also do an error, trigger an error if required. So if once the success happens, the data AJAX success event gets triggered, we are sending it out to everybody, but this same mixin also is included in everybody. So even for intra-component or intra-mixin interactions, you take this kind of a decouple approach that the event is for everybody, and in fact, even if you want to react to it yourself, you'll have to do so through events. That's a very nice way of structuring your application. So when that event gets fired, data hijack success, look down again. Whenever I receive that event, I'm triggering the this handle success function, which takes me to that second function over there, which is where the template is, where we actually are rendering the template. And once that rendering happens, I'm again triggering an event like saying the data is rendered. So that's something, somebody may process it. Yeah. So that's again an event for somebody else to look at. So once I extract all that repeated reusable functionality out, all that I need for my component that is trying to do rendering on the client, that's all the piece of code that you need to do that, and it doesn't depend on however many number of elements, UI elements it has, because our templating takes care of all that. So here I defined a component where I'm passing the URL field component property, which will then be picked up by our mixin, and so nice, right? So this takes me a bit to the previous talk. I really don't have much answers now about how to actually integrate Fly into your Rails app in the best possible manner. Probably it's still open to discussions, but you can already imagine that we don't any longer depend on how on the default JS files that the Rails controller generator throws at you. You probably will end up using more JS files on the client depending on the number of components you actually end up using. So you may be able to nicely use require.js coupled with these components to further classify your components and your maybe screens, I could rather say, into subfolders under the JavaScript folder of their own, right? So there's a lot of things that can be done here, but we have looked at all the possibilities, all the techniques and tools to be able to get into that direction. I have a small demo if you have time. 2 minutes for the demo alone? Okay. This is bad. Okay, this is a little better. So this is a Flight app. It pretends to be a Rails app, which actually it is, but I didn't get the time to flesh out the backend stuff much. But whenever you restart this, what happens is that this calendar actually is not regular HTML. This is SVG. I'm using Raffle.js to generate this SVG. The good thing about SVG compared to Canvas, if you're aware, is that actually gives you a handle to each of these elements, because actually at the end of the day, these are HTML elements. Actually, SVG is the element name. So I get a handle to this. So whenever I refresh it, what happens is that firstly, this calendar gets rendered, and today's date gets highlighted, because that's something that I don't really have a control over, because that's something that you do when you are, I could actually do it, but that's not how I've done it. So whenever I find that today's date is the date that I'm on currently, I just give it a different color. But that's just for this red 19 that you see, that is for that. The highlight thing is now from there on entirely evented. So once it renders, I get an event that today is the 19th, and ID is also what I get, ID of that element. That gets triggered to everybody, including to this component itself, so that once it gets the ID back from that trigger, it knows exactly which of those cells, if you can call it, to highlight. So that is when this actually happens. And also, I'm passing two data variables. One is the ID of that element, and the other is the actual date. So the date element gets passed to this component, which I'm calling, I guess, the day component, I guess. It's bound to an element which is around here. So whenever the day component is attached, and whenever it receives that event that you have to load this particular date, it gets that data from the backend. Currently this is mocked up, so this is from a JSON file inside my app itself. And then that will load up the events corresponding to that particular day. So I hope you get a sense of how decoupled and how evented this is. It's a joy really a joy to work with JavaScript like this. So I have another small function I can show you. This is another component which I can stuff out something with the dates. I haven't really done any validation. So you save it. This is another component. This triggers an event when it gets hidden. Once that happens, I'm using templates here heavily to get that newly added event, and it gets appended here. So again, that is totally evented. No linear programming at all anywhere in this project, in this particular app. I think this is very cool. So getting back to my slides, I don't have anything else. I'll just leave you with a list of references and the things that I've touched upon in this talk.